So we've talked about the problem with SDSs, right? We said that in the beginning they were recommended, they were not required, and then more people got involved and more agencies decided to require certain aspects to be met in an SDS, and there had to be a reason, right? There had to be a reason that we went from recommended to requirement, and even with the requirement, we're saying that SDSs are sometimes inaccurate, misleading, and incomplete. And they are typically okay with that, right? They're not saying that everything has to be accurate in the report or in the document. What they're basically stating is that you have to provide one. So by providing one, if it does have lies and misleading information in it, that's still okay, people. And that's kind of scary if you really stop and think about it, right? That really means that they can provide you with an SDS and half of it could be bull, and you would read it and you would assume that it was true. And if something happened and it wasn't listed in the document, or they told you to do something in the document that wasn't required, and you try to sue them, you couldn't, because they are not legal documents. Even though that they're a requirement, they are not legal documents. There are always disclaimers on the inside. All right, so let's talk about the skepticism that surrounds the SDS field, okay? So the SDSs really have two things that are going for them. Number one, it provides some type of data that we can use in regards to the compound. And number two, they also provide recommendations. So the recommendations are things like how to handle it, how to dispose of it, how to work with it, how to store it. Those are the types of things that you would find in this document. Data would be things like formula weights and melting points and chemical compositions and chemical structures. Those are the things that you would find on the data side. The data side is typically correct. Okay, and the reason that I say this is because these are typically some types of tests or some types of properties that we have known for many, many years concerning the actual chemical itself. So none of that's going to change, right? Once we find the boiling point of a compound, then that boiling point is typically going to stay that boiling point from here on out forever, right? The same thing's going to happen with formula weights and chemical structures. Once you find that information, nothing really can happen that's going to make this thing fuzzy or become untrue later on in the future. So once you determine these properties are pretty much set in stone. Data is a great SDSs are a great place to find this type of data, okay? This type of data, however, could also easily be found on the internet, even through Wikipedia, because those are many verified sources that Wikipedia uses. So even though you've heard us say, stay away from the online Google searches, stay away from Wikipedia, anyone could go in and modify and change statements. Well, you can't really change and modify physical data that much. So it is what it is, people, and that's why we say typically it is correct. Now, if it is not correct, what happens? If it's not correct, what has typically happened here is that there is some type of clerical error or what we would call a typo error. So entering it into the document, someone has mistyped or put in the wrong digits, maybe for a melting point or for a formula weight or for a chemical structure, and no one caught it before it went to publish. So that's really the reason that we would find an error if there was one associated with the data section. These things are typically caught, though, very quickly as they are delivered out to customers and clients, and those are addressed promptly, and they make the correct changes, and they will issue new SDSs for that reason. So again, the data, not a problem at all. Now, number two are the recommendations. Number two is really where we start to see some vague, some cloudiness, some statements that are very general. And they're either not going to help us, or it won't make sense, or they are just basically incorrect. All right, a whole number of reasons and things that are happening during that section. We'll talk about the recommendations a little bit later on, but right now we'll continue on with our discussion with data and the basics of an SDS before we get to that point. A current study was actually done. They pulled 150 SDS sheets or SD sheets. I don't need to say SDS sheets because that stands for Safety Data Sheets, and that doesn't really make any sense. So 150 SDSs were studied, and it showed that around 11% of these were misidentified. That's 1 in 10 people. 1 in 10 were misidentified. Not only that, but 50% of SDSs had wrong health information. Now imagine that. Health information. One of the things that I would want to find an SDS for. I want to know my exposure level. If I absorb this through my skin, what's going to happen to me? 50% of those were wrong. Not only were they wrong in the health information, but also the exposure information. Hey, I'm working with this chemical and I've spilt some on my skin, and this is approximately how much? Oh, well, the SDS said by my exposure level, it had to be much greater than this, so I'm okay. Half of them are wrong. It's kind of scary. Oh, well, I spilled it on my skin, and yeah, I'm over the exposure limit. So, hey, I'm reading this thing in the health section, and the health section says, well, I can just probably wash it off. It's not going to really hurt me. And then later on down the road, you might be diagnosed with cancer. 50%, that's kind of scary, concerning just the health information section and the exposure information section. Now, I will say that this 50% basically means, number one, it was just completely wrong. Wrong statements, they lied to us, nothing more than that. Or number two, it was incomplete. Meaning they tried, but they didn't give you the whole story. And some people would scratch their head and say, well, why was it incomplete? Why would they only give me part of the information? And that's because in the past, they were just recommended. It was not required. So some of those are still filtering over into the current SDSs. And as they're getting filtered over, they need to be corrected. And until someone catches it and tries to go back and enforce them to correct or expand or clearly define the section that they're working in, they're going to continue to be wrong. In addition to that, another statistic that you need to know, out of 19 major chemical accidents that have happened, chemical accidents on the industrial scale, if you look at the last 19 of them, 10 of them were because of wrong information in an MSDS document. Again, that's kind of scary. We're talking about buildings blowing up. We're talking about people losing their lives. We're talking about major fire and explosion breakouts. And these companies and lab managers used the MSDS or SDS to determine how to store, how to handle, and how to dispose of the chemicals. And something happened. And that happened because of wrong information that were in these documents. Not because of what the company did. Not because of the decisions that the CEO made, or what the laboratory managers made, or what the bigwigs made that was running the company. It was due to the fact that the MSDS was wrong. And that is what they relied on to get the information on how to properly handle the chemical, because it's called safety data sheet. So why would a safety data sheet not tell me what I need to know about safety? Doesn't make any sense. Now, most people will continue to use SDS. I'm not saying that every one of them are wrong. I'm not saying that if they are wrong in major ways. What I'm saying is that they are not perfect. They're not set in stone. Do not treat them like the chemical version of a Bible. The information that's presented on the inside could be incorrect, and you need to just accept that fact. Get over it. That's just the way it is. And for us, as a laboratory worker, what we would want to do is to make sure that we kind of understand the overall picture of the chemical that we're using. Okay. In addition to all of this, the SDSs are typically used for 3 reasons. Number 1, safety. What are the safety procedures that are associated with the chemical that I have in my hand, that I'm getting ready to work with? Number 2, medical. If I drink it, if it gets in my hair, if it gets in my eyes, if it absorbs to the skin, if I breathe it in, what steps should I take to make sure that I stay healthy? And number 3, disposal. How do I get rid of it once I use it? These are the 3 major reasons that an SDS is used. This is why we have them. This is why people crack open the book and try to find the chemical. Again, some of these chemicals might be unknown. You might never have had any previous experience using these. And if so, this is a good place to start. It's not a perfect place to be, but it's a good place to start. But with that said, safety, medical, and disposal, there are issues. Number 1, all of these recommendations, now we're talking about the recommendation section, the recommendation part. All of these recommendations are very broad. They are written in a way to be as general as possible. So because of that, they have very little use. That's kind of depressing. I mean, I'm going to the SDS to see what I should be doing to keep myself safe, and I read a statement that could say, wear appropriate protective equipment. What does that mean? Does that mean full-blown bodysuit? Does that mean respirator? Does that mean goggles and gloves? Sometimes they won't tell me. And that's a very general, broad statement that has very little use to me. Number 2, another thing that we have to keep in mind, again, and I keep saying it, is that these are meant for large scale, not the smaller quantities that we are using in a laboratory. So yeah, it's great source of information. It gives me some more details about the stuff that I'm using in a lab and that I'm working with. But by all means, that's not the purpose of the SDS. That's not what they intended to be in the beginning. They intended to go to big chemical companies, big chemical industries that are using large, extremely large amounts of these at a time. And number 3, the other problem that we see with the SDSs, someone has to write them. So who does it? Well, number 1, academics do. Well, that's pretty good, right? I mean, these guys are working with chemicals all day long, so they should know at least what they're talking about a little bit. But let me tell you something. Academics are the same as any doctor or dentist or nurse that you will come across. You can still get a C or a D and still pass and get your degree. Just because you carry a PhD around doesn't mean anything. Just because you teach a chemistry class doesn't mean that you actually know what's going on around you. So yeah, academics and the idea of academics, great. But they're pretty stupid ones out there. And you hope and cross your fingers that those stupid ones are not writing the SDSs for you. That's just the way it is. And it's that way in any profession. Number 2, actual full-blown scientist. Some of those are still stupid too. We've got really good scientists. I mean, if it wasn't for them, we would not have some of the medications and stuff that we use today. But you also have some slacks that work in a laboratory that call themselves a scientist that get by with very little every single day, and they could contribute to an SDS. Who knows? You hope you don't have one of those SDSs. Next, physicians. Same story, people. Again, I've said it and I'll say again. Just because you're a doctor doesn't mean that you're a good doctor. Again, I can get a C or a D in every single class and still pass and get my degree at the very end. Is that who you want for your doctor? Or do you want someone that's aced every course? So just because they're a physician doesn't mean anything. But physicians do contribute to the SDS, and you can kind of imagine that their purpose would be on the medical side. The academics and the scientists, their purpose would be maybe a little bit of safety, maybe a little bit of disposal. Who else writes them? Well, we get lazy and we let automated computer systems write them. Could you imagine? We're relying on a computer to write a safety data sheet. Sometimes I can't even rely on my computer to start up. But I'm going to rely on a computer to automatically shove information into a document, and I'm supposed to think that the computer knows exactly what it's talking about? Well, truth be told, the computer basically scans the document and they will insert statements that are very general statements just to cover the company's butt that makes the chemical. That's the purpose of the computer software program. No one wants to sit and constantly type the same phrases over and over and over for every chemical that they're making and that they're shipping out. So for that reason, the computer systems put somewhat of an automation to the process. They will put in all of those general clauses and statements that are needed for a proper SDS to make them kind of proper, but at the same time enough disclaimers that no one's being held responsible. They can't be anyway, but no one's held responsible for the info. And finally, who else have their hands in it? Lawyers. It's great, isn't it? A company produces a chemical. That chemical gets shipped to buyers. That chemical has an SDS page. That company's lawyer or teams of lawyers will get together and they will review the SDS before it's sent and before it's finalized. Why do they do this? So that way if something happens on your end and you try to sue the company, again, they're not legal documents though, but if you try, the lawyers have basically covered the company's butt to make sure that they are not going to be held reliable for anything that's happened on your end because you've misused a chemical or mishandled it. If there's a false statement in the SDS and it was brought to someone's attention, well, that false statement cannot be held in the court of law. That's the purpose of the lawyers. Great, isn't it? So these are the teams of great people that are working together to create a safety data sheet that you have to be held responsible to read and understand and think that it's going to save you because you're learning how to properly handle a chemical. Now, that was a big Debbie Downer moment, wasn't it? I've basically led you through a 20-minute discussion of the awfulness of an SDS. And you know what? It's going to continue. So in the next video, we're going to pick up from this. We're going to talk more details about an SDS, and we're going to start picking them apart and kind of figuring out what to make of these documents.